1.15, if I've upgraded one to 1.15, but I haven't upgraded the other one yet, I don't want to upgrade my backup repository until all of my Velero instances have been upgraded. So I think we do want to add the ability to upgrade via maintenance, but I think it needs to be an optional setting in the repo maintenance settings, not something that we always do by default.
Yeah. So first of all, for the copy part, when we talk about the compatibility, we need to consider the uploader and the repository, right? So here, so for the uploader, when the data uploaded to the data format uploaded to the repository changes, when you do a full backup, so this not relevant to the repo format or the capability of upgrading repo format. That's one thing. So we need to do a full
But if you have
backup.
one repo for a namespace, how do you have two repo formats? Are we set up to be able to do that? So if I have an existing repo and I upgrade Velero, we need to make a new backup. And how does I should be able to restore the old backup, but then I make a new backup? Are we able to have two different backups with different repo formats in the same backup repository? How does that work?
Actually, if we only talk about the uploader data format changes, it's not happening that two backups have two different formats, because when the uploader upgrades and the old data format cannot fit, it will do a full backup automatically. So it will never refer to the previous backup, right?
Well, right, but the previous backup still exists. So I mean, the full backup will not refer to the previous backup. But if the previous backup hasn't expired yet, because the user wants to be able to restore that old backup, until that backup expires, we need that repository, that backup to be restorable.
Yeah, but I have to say that once the uploader data format changes, user have to use the old Velero version, previous Velero version, to read the old backup. Because
how does that work in the repository? So if I have my backup storage location, we put the backup repository, in the Copia directory based on the namespace. If I have an old backup and then we upgrade Velero and then we make the new backup that's a full backup, do both of those backups that are different versions coexist in the bucket? How does that work?
Yeah, so here we have the uploader data format and the repo format. When we talk about the first question, we presume that the repo format is not changed. It is the same and across all the versions. So here we only talk about the first question. We only talk about the uploader data format. For example, we can think about the Velero's resource backup. So we have the back table, and for the next version, we do some changes to the table or add a new table. So the new backup. So we want to make the compatibility as possible as we can. But if we cannot, we will not be able to read the old data that by the previous version. So we will have to do a full backup, and the old data will be validated by the previous version without uploader. So the same for copy uploader. We only talk about the uploader data changes. So when the next question is the repo data format change. The repo data format change, we will need to create a new repo and do a full backup.
How do you? So if you create a new repo, what happens with the old repo? If we're still using the same backup storage location, is the new repo and the old repo still coexist in a way that we can access them both with the different Velero versions?
No, I think the new version of Velero or copy never need to access the old repo. It's only access the new repo.
But if you have an old backup that hasn't expired, my concern is the old backup. Again, imagine the customer where they need to retain old backups for some longer period of time. I have a new backup, like you said, it's the new repo version, new copy uploader. But someone comes in and puts in a request saying, hey, I need to restore my backup from 2 months ago because I just found out that my data got corrupted a month ago.
Yeah.
So the latest backup's not good. I need to update the old, restore the old backup. Whether or not I have to go to an old Velero version to do it is a different question. I'm not asking that. I'm saying if we have the old backup that's not expired yet from the old Velero version,
Yeah.
and then the new backup we just made, and the repo version changed, so it's a full backup. Do we have two Copia repositories in that bucket? How does that work?
Yeah. So first of all, I agree that the old backup should be preserved until its expiration date. That is for sure. But first of all, for the data format, either the uploader or the repository, uh, I mean, for backup or resource software, it is a very basic principle that we need to keep the data format as possible as we can. So what we are talking about is only happen in the rare case. It is not a normal maintenance or operation that every several version we need to change the data format of the repo. So once this happens, I think the only thing safe and that is friendly enough we can do is we create a new repo and run full backup. And for the old backup, we will keep it there and never let it expire. And but that old backup will
that means we need
I
two
think,
repos to exist in the bucket, right?
I think probably Yonghui, I think Scott's concern is that you create a new backup repo in the same BSL may be problematic because there's a conflict or collision in terms of namespace. So probably we need to set up a new BSL for the new repo.
That is operational level thing. I mean, that is a detailed thing. So here, at least for now, we don't encounter this scenario. So when we encounter that, and I think the first thing we need to do is we need to have a read note to mark a break change, and also what we need to do some operations to remove the conflict, like we have another Copia folder. I mean, in the Copia prefix or folder, or we have another BSL. That is both option. But right now, I think that detailed things, and we can solve that before.
I guess my main concern is it sounds like from what Tiger has said and from what Mikhail said last week, because he'd done some research in this, Copia has APIs that allow you to upgrade an existing repo. So if you had an old backup using an old repo format, the new version of Copia has a new repo format. If you perform the upgrade procedure on that repo, then you can still do an incremental backup because that makes the old data compatible with the new format.
Yes.
To that, we don't need a new repo. We can still keep doing incremental backups, and I think it solves the problem.
So first of all, that command, I mean the Copia repository upgrade command is to upgrade the repository that is around the index management area, because the index management is only the thing that I think since Copia exists, it is the only thing that break the compatibility. So Copia has a command to do that. But first of all, that right before the change. Sorry. So first of all, Velero integrate with Copia after the change, so it doesn't affect Velero. That is one thing, and the other thing is like as we mentioned here, the repository upgrade is a very heavy and dangerous thing. For example, as we talk about the copy upgrade command, it will need to read all the indexes to the memory and do some reorganization, and write it down to the repository. So it's very dangerous. So what we prefer is to leave this option to users. I mean, user can connect this repo through the Copia command and run the repository if they want. Run the upgrade if they want. And also this is what is happening for Copia itself, because the copy also mentioned that it will never automatically upgrade the repo. So it's on the user's command to upgrade the repo, right? So here we do the same thing. We can document this option, like if in future, if some,
but,
yeah.
I don't think.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I even don't think we need to document something in future. We just let user know when the breakage happens because it's rare, right?
I mean,
Yes,
I think there's two
and
things.
something.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like I'm saying, you know, if the CLI is the way to do that, that might make sense too. You know, if we're going to be telling users to use the Copia CLI though, do we want to build the Copia CLI and put it in our Velero image? Because since we're using a different commits, we want them to use a Copia CLI that's the same code as our Velero, right? So it might make sense for us to build the CLI into the Velero image so they can use the CLI that corresponds to the same Copia code that's, you know, running on Velero.
Yeah, that is what we can do, and that may be better. But actually, right now, when we want to debug Copia repository, we will also tell users to run some Copia debug command to collect the information. So I'm not sure if we need to consider all this together.
Yeah.
Or
yeah, I mean, with Restic, for example, you know, since we didn't since Velero invokes Restic using the CLI, it's easy for a Velero user to use Restic because they can just use the same Restic binary that we build. For Copia, we use the library, so we don't have a binary there. I'm just wondering if we're going to get to the point where we start recommending users to run the Copia CLI, I think we want to build that CLI as part of the build process so that we can guarantee that the Copia code that the CLI uses is compatible completely with the Velero Copia library code that we're using. You know, build it from our fork. Even if it's not the same image, you know, the point is we need to have a Copia binary that's an official Velero build that corresponds to the same Copia code that Velero, you know, the same version uses. Otherwise, users start running the Copia binary and it's from some upstream build that doesn't correspond with whatever we've cherry picked. They could hit unknown bugs, unexpected problems.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think we definitely should build Copia CLI binary from Velero's forked repo, but in terms of how to deliver that,
yeah, I mean that's a different question.
Yeah,
you know, the easiest thing might be to put. Well, I mean, you could include it in the Velero image. You could just have it downloadable. I don't think that, you know, we could deliver it the same way we deliver the Velero CLI, because we do have a, you know, when we build a release, we have a Velero CLI that's downloadable. I'm less concerned about the method of delivery because, you know, certainly on the OADP side, we're going to be repackaging that in our image anyway. I just think we should be clear on if we're going to start recommending users use the Copia CLI for various tasks, including repo upgrades, we want to make sure we have a process to make sure they're using the right CLI and not something random they downloaded.
Yes.
Yes, I need to tag two things offline. First thing is because I remember Copia is not so friendly to Mac operating system. I need to check that because our CLI just support Mac and Linux, right? So that's one thing. And the other thing is, you know, we are not directly using the Copia upstream code. We have some self-managed check.
That's exactly why I'm saying we want to build a binary from that same code because of that difference.
I think that makes sense.
Okay. Okay, I got that. I need to check this offline for some detailed things, but I think basically it should work. And just one reminder, it makes some side effect that it will introduce a Copia code to Velero's client command, right?
No, I don't think we need to provide Copia command as a subcommand of Velero. Like I said, yeah, I think that's a separate topic. I think in terms of how we deliver that CLI to user, there are many ways.
Yeah, I think the Copia CLI by itself makes more sense. If you try to integrate the Velero CLI, then you have to deal with one-to-one correspondence of options, and you get a bunch of mess there. I don't think there's no value there.
Right.
Okay. So the other option is we build a Copia command and CLI with the project Velero copy repository, code repository, and deliver this to users, right?
Yeah, and we can do that on demand probably because like you said, it's rare. We need to do that.
I mean, it's mainly an issue if we get to a point where a user's upgrading, and then if they're gonna have an incompatibility at all, then they're gonna want to do the Copia repo upgrade. If they have old backups they care about, they want to be able to be, because then they can run that upgrades against the repo, and then they can still do incremental backups, and they can still restore the old backups. So I think
Yeah.
I mean, my main point was we want this as a process that's not automatic, but that it can be done. My earlier thinking was make it an optional step of repo maintenance. If we want to make it a CLI separate and out of manual step, I think that's fine too. It's only going to happen. You only need to run this once on each repo when you upgrade Velero. So it's a one-time thing per upgrade. I think it's not unreasonable to say, let's make this a CLI thing you run. But we do need to provide that CLI so that we can be sure that the Copia version they're upgrading to matches exactly. Because what I don't want as a user is to download a Copia release, do a Copia version upgrade to my Velero repo, but I used a different code base that Velero is using, and so they don't match anymore.
Yeah, I agree. At least for now, Copia CLI is still working, but yes, I got your point. And
can I just see if I understand what the summary is here? I think the Copia repo will not be upgraded via maintenance job automatically. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think the idea is we would provide documentation for users as part of the upgrade documentation to say, optionally, if you want to upgrade your Copia repo to the newest version of Velero because you're no longer using the old version for anything, run this step for each backup repository that you're still depending on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
so before we go and tell our everyone to do that, what if we break someone's repo from running? It's just my only concern. Maybe that's
also a concern if Velero does it directly for the user.
Yeah, that's 100%.
I think we should. I mean, we need to do some testing around this. Certainly on the IDP side, we need to do this as part of our upgrade testing before we tell any customer to do that.
Yeah, okay. Actually, we will choose the most safe way that we will not break the user data, because that is what we cannot afford, right? So we have a bunch of things that need to do here. First of all, because for example, before the user can run the command, even though we have that delivering with Velero, but we need to make sure that no backup or restore, no access to the repo is happening, right? So how do we block the other operations from doing that? That is another question. And
that's another thing, I guess, which favors the manual approach. I think that is a concern. If repo maintenance is doing this, if I have two clusters both using the same BSL, and repo maintenance in one cluster is upgrading Copia while cluster 2 is trying to run a backup or restore, they're going to clash, and that's bad. If it's a manual step, the documentation can include shut down your Velero instances and all your clusters that use this BSL first to guarantee that no one's going to touch it, then run the repo upgrades, then start Velero up again.
Yes, it's better, but we still have some risk, because even though we document that, but user may not follow that. And if that there is some risk to break the repo, we need to think more about it, right? So to do some, safeguard or something like that. I don't know. I just have some idea. We need to further consider it. Right?
Please go ahead.
So fortunately, right now we don't have this face this situation, so we have enough time to think about this beforehand, And yeah.
Yeah, I just want to point out, after all, using copia command provided by us to upgrade the repo is still optional. User can always choose to, set up a new BSL, do full backup, and use a new Velero with a new format of copia.
Yeah, I think that is always the first recommendation from us. Yes.
Yeah, but that is a thing where you were telling users, if this upgrade is going to change, change the copia format, then what you really want to do is create new backup repositories, which means creating a new BSL.
That's not quite the seamless upgrade.
No, it's not.
No.
I mean, it's a good idea.
Because
it's not seamless.
I mean, you don't even need a new bucket. You can just use a new. You can use a new prefix for the bucket.
Correct.
Yeah, prefix.
But it's not totally seamless, because then the problem with the new BSL is then if you want to restore an old backup. Well, no, I guess it's true, because if you create a new BSL for new backups, make the old one read only, because we do have that option to make backups read only. BSLs read only. That gives you the option. Then you can still restore with the current Velero, because the way Copia works, you're still able to restore a snapshot from the old format. It's just that you can't do incremental with the new format. So,
that is not guaranteed by.
That's true. It's not guaranteed. Yeah, I mean that guarantee becomes, that's part of the problem we're talking about here. Is that but if it's not guaranteed, then you're forced to do the upgrade. Unless you want to downgrade Velero. And the problem with installing the old version of Velero is because the CRDs are cluster scoped, you can't install the old version of Velero without uninstalling the new version of Velero.
Would it make sense as part on the BSL prefix to inject a version number going forward? So
yes, actually, I have discussed with Daniel offline previously, some days ago, about this topic. When we want to manage the conflict or to cope with the conflict problem in future, we may need to add a new prefix to the existing or before the copia folder, that it will have the version number to the copia repository.
Yeah,
that is I think that is one possible, or probably the most possible option.
If the copia repo gets the version number, then you don't need a new BSL. If we manage that automatically with Velero, saying okay, new Velero, we always the prefix right now. The prefix is what directory everything gets put in. It may be under copia. We have it create an additional subdirectory under that prefix by version, so that automatically on upgrade, if I go from 1.14 to 1.15. It'll be /copia /1.15 in the repo. So we automatically create a new backup repository for each version.
Yeah, so that is another gap. If we talk about the detail things. But I have to say that we don't need to do that for every version of Velero release, right? Because it
becomes an issue when you get to a point where this version of Copia is incompatible with that version. And again, again, as I understand Copia's strategy, they're saying that in general they only promise -1, but the reality is they'll keep it longer if they can, but also they're going to keep read only longer than the ability to write to it, which means if we get to a point where we can't do an incremental backup against the old version, we can still restore the old version, but new backups need to use the new version. It might be simpler to just always create a new repo on upgrade, so that every time you go from, say, Velero 1.14 to 1.15, your first backup is going to be full backup, not incremental, upon upgrade. The old ones, again, are still restorable, assuming Copia hasn't broken the read-only capability. And then those eventually go away once those backups expire.
And that is feasible technically, but but as we just mentioned that the repo or uploader format change is a rare thing, and so if we do this for every version of Velero, we will break many user functionalities. Like they have to store data in the two separate, even in the same object or the same bucket, but in separate location.
And also, running a full new backup would be annoying for some customers too.
Yeah, it would be annoying. I mean, it would only happen upon upgrade, but yeah, if we limited it to incompatible changes, then we would just need some metadata around, okay,
yeah,
let's assume, yeah, okay, we had the 1.14 Copia repo, and we need some metadata in Velero saying, okay, 1.15, 1.16, those are still good with 1.14 repos. It's only when you get to 1.17 that we have to make a new one.
I wonder also if, I mean, we're trying to design and plan around an eventual breakage with Copia that doesn't exist yet. And I wonder if just making sure we have the adequate testing, upstream, downstream, well documented, well tested, so that we have plenty of notice, like in the future, at least, when this does actually happen. And then we can have like a special upgrade for this version of Velero, and maybe this one.
If you did that, you'd never have to do the whole special prefix thing. You could just say, okay,
right,
we've determined via testing that Velero 1.17 is going to be incompatible with old Copia repos. So when you upgrade this Velero, you have to run the Copia CLI to upgrade your old repos, or you have to make new BSLs, and then just put that on the user.
So first of all, of course we need to build these mechanisms. And actually, we already do part of that. We are doing, yeah.
I think following Scott's comment, we do not have to do that if we choose to use a new BSL when the breakage happens.
Well, right. I'm saying it's either or. If the breakage happens, the user would have two choices. They could either upgrade their existing repos if it matters. Like, I'm imagining a customer that's got 5,000 volumes, big volumes. They don't want to do incremental upgrades.
Yeah,
they're going to want to update their repo.
So here we have two options. First of all, we make a new repository or BSL for every version of Velero. Secondly,
no, absolutely not. We should ask user to do that.
Oh yes,
only when there's
right. That's what I'm saying. Only when there's a
breakage.
They could upgrade the repos using the Copia CLI. Or they could create new BSLs and stop using the old BSLs for new backups. I think those are two manual in other words, this is something we could do with no Velero code changes. If we determine incompatibility testing, we could give users two options. And this is the easiest thing to do. This is not doing anything automatic in Velero. This is telling users you have two choices here. You can either upgrade your repo with the CLI, or you can make new BSLs, and not back up to the old BSLs anymore.
Yeah, by this, let me add one more example. We talk about the full backup thing, the full backup problem, and another problem. Like I have used the repo for many backups, so I have several TBL data. Let's say several TBL data. So my current dedupe ratio is for example 1 to 10, and then if I have to change it to a new repo, I will not get the benefit from the duplication.
Right, you have a full backup. You have to back up the entire thing.
It's not only about a full backup. Not only about a full backup. It's about the whole repo data. I mean, the deduplication has lost.
Right, you're basically backing up like from the beginning. Every byte on your volumes has to be backed up from scratch. If you go to a new repo.
For example, my full backup is 500 MB. GB, and but I have make many backups, so my repo data, I mean the loaded data, must be much larger than the 500 GB. So if I use the existing repository, I will get benefit from the deduplication, and I will save much less data, even for the full backup. Right?
So in that case, you want to upgrade the repo. You want to use the Copia repo upgrade CLI. And once you do that, then you can still do the incremental backup.
Yes.
That's why I'm saying there's a choice. There's
Yeah,
running the CLI to upgrade your repos, and then you should be able to continue to get incremental backups.
But
there's a risk.
Then another thing is we will force users to upgrade the repo if they want to have the benefit, keep the benefit. But here the thing is we don't want to force the user to do the upgrade, because even the upgrade itself is dangerous to users. User will be hesitant to do
that's
that.
right.
But I don't
right.
think there's other choice, right?
That's where they get the choice.
Hold on. Yep. Either way, if you our community, our customers aren't going to love either of these two options if they're forced to do so.
Right. But I mean,
they're going to be they're going to be mad at us.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, even if Velero automates this, those are still the only choices we're talking about. If you have repo incompatibilities, you literally, at a Copia level, you have exactly two choices: upgrade your repo or make a new one.
Sure. We get it, but there's lots of storage involved, time involved.
So the choice for users is, if you need to, if you need the old backups and the new ones together, and you have a long, and basically users that have a long backup retention period are going to want to upgrade the repos. Users that have a shorter retention period.
No, actually, I think for most users, they will choose to keep the repo as is and not do the upgrade, and use the old version to do the restore.
Unless you have many terabytes, the issue is if you have a long retention policy, I need to keep my backups for a year. Then if you have to start over with full backups, you're going to take a lot more storage. So for those users with a long retention policy, they're going to want to upgrade the repos so they can continue to do incremental backups on day one.
We need to be really
retention policy.
We need to be really proactive with the testing here, because all the scenarios we're talking about for solutions to this, our customers are going to scream.
Oh yeah, but I'm just saying, between those two scenarios, the customers that are going to really have to do the upgrade are the ones that need to keep backups for a year, because they don't want to double their storage. If you're not going to keep backups very long, if you're only keeping them the 30 days or whatever, then you can afford to make a new backup repo, because this is a temporary bootstrapping thing, and after a month it goes away.
So there's two things. There's we really need to make sure that the upgrade process works, and we have plenty of old backups and tests around that.
Process, you mean?
Repo upgrade. Yeah. And I guess the other one is just starting from fresh, and that has to be well documented, and hopefully we'll never have to.
Right.
Well, eventually,
starting from fresh we know works, because that's just making a new repo, a new VSL. But we absolutely would have to test Copia upgrades as part of the process if we were going to recommend.
Maybe this is a reason for holding the Copia version back in a particular release, so we can really.
So we have the both, right?
The problem with holding it back is then now you're holding Copia code that upstream no longer maintains, and then it's totally on us to fix CVEs and all that. So that's the downside of that.
That is true, but we might need a full release cycle to handle something like this.
Oh yeah, no, that makes sense. If we see an incompatibility, like you said, say we determine, say for 1.16 we upgrade Copia again from 0.17 to 0.19. We see a problem. Oh, this is incompatible. Backtrack. Let's not do it for 1.16 because we see incompatibilities. Let's give ourselves a full release cycle to test through this and work through the options, and hold the Copia for one release to fix it. I think
exactly right.
In other words, if we see a problem in our pre-release testing, we might want to revert that change and document, hey, we see an incompatibility on the horizon. We don't want to throw this at the users right at an upgrade time. We need one more release to absorb this. That does make some sense. Then, we're not holding it forever. We're just saying we need one more release cycle to fully test the upgrade process, figure out what we want to recommend to the users, and go through that process.
That's right.
Okay, so let me conclude. So we basically want two options together. First of all, we need to distinguish the breaks by checking the commit and by testing, and then we have the release note. And then user have the option to create a new BSL or to keep the current one.
And run the Copia upgrade CLI.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think those are the two options. I just think to Wes's point, if we determine, because usually when we do the Copia update, it's somewhere in the release cycle, maybe not at the end, but somewhere in the development cycle, okay, we're going to upgrade Copia, push that through, we test with that. If we determine that the Copia upgrade we just pushed is results in backups that can't be incremental and compatibilities like that, that may be a time to say, oh, well, let's revert this change. Let's document that the next version of Velero is going to have this incompatibility, and then we give ourselves a release cycle to work through the testing to make sure that we're not throwing something on users that we've had minimal testing with.
Which also means, and I don't know where these tests are, at least in the upstream, but I would love to see where, if those are visible, I would love to see those. I know we're going to start looking at this and helping and contributing and doing it downstream the whole bit. But yeah, let's be really careful.
Yeah, okay.
When that happens.
Okay. So I think we have we can do some follow-up discussions offline, and but I think we have a good conclusion here for today's discussion. Okay.
Yeah,
so we will continue that. Yeah. Yes, thanks. And the next topic, Shubham, please.
Yeah, we have another issue here. So Velero allows restore of resource status, but if you open up that issue, so basically we wanted to allow restore of status based on some annotation or label on the custom resource, but here currently we allow based on resource type. So that's the issue. So basically, sometimes users don't know whether the restore of the resource status is needed or not, right? So if we allow this via annotation or label on custom resource, the controller which creates the resource would itself annotate the resource and automate the process. So that's the use case we are seeing here.
Yeah, and I would say I see this kind of similar, like when we do hooks, there's two ways to specify a hook, either on the restore itself or on its annotation. The idea being we already have code right now in the restore that says, should update update status. And right now that only looks at the list of resources in the restore spec. So this change, I think, really is pretty simple. It really just narrows down to, instead of looking at restore spec, we look at if this resource is specified in the restore spec, or the item has an annotation saying restore status, one that we define. If either of those is true, we restore status. And this provides a way. So if I maintain an application that I know my users are using Velero to back up, I can set that if I have a certain resource in my application that needs status updates. That way the user can ignore it and just run their restores normally.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
I'm guessing this is something we'd think about in the 1.16 timeframe.
Yeah,
it's a new feature, so obviously it wouldn't be a bug fix. But at the same time, obviously it's too late for 1.15. But it seems like it's a pretty straightforward feature. We should be able to do in the 1.16 timeframe.
Yeah, we also
Lyndon,
need
Yeah, go, please add it to 1.16 milestone. Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
Yeah, I imagine a fairly simple design PR first that kind of specifies how it's going to work. Specifies the way we expect it to work, and once that's approved, then the implementation should be pretty straightforward. But basically, define the annotation, define how it works. Yep, and the logic.
Yeah, we will add that later because right now we don't have the 16
okay.
milestone.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I just added as a candidate. Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, I have assigned myself, so fine.
Okay, thanks, Shubham. Yes, I think that's all items for us today. And any other questions or comments here? Okay.
I just want to give a quick heads up. It's gonna be a public holiday next Monday and Tuesday in China. So yeah, just FYI.
Yeah.
No additional information.
Okay. Okay. Thanks all, and see you for the next. See you for the next meeting, and have a good day and evening. Bye bye.
Yep.
Thank you. Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.